Listening to Thomas, and I'm starting to think about the algorithm that INET has to use for picking the place to hold its conference. So the first criteria is that the leading officials are reluctant to appear. And the second criteria appears to be that you have people who are the agents of change, like Peter Jungen, like Thomas, like Olaf Storbeck, who are trying to help things along. And then I guess the third ingredient, which we learned about on the fly, is you need a vibrant group of young people who give you the hope and the faith that this will all be realized in time and that they will carry that tradition. Our panel tonight are people who are not beleaguered with the woes directly of America or Europe. They have a different vantage point on the world economy, and each and every one of them is a very creative thinker. And to moderate the session, to introduce them, and shepherd the process is Chrystia Freeland from Reuters, who I must testify was the person who helped INET find its first founding partner in the case of Jim Balsillie. Chrystia has been very, very supportive of INET from the beginning, always keeping an eye out, calling me about things to do, ideas, and in this case, a tremendous resource who's become our key founding partner. So, Chrystia, thank you, and please help us to enjoy the rest of the evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Good evening, everyone. So I've learned a couple of things just this evening. The first one is that Rob Johnson is German. We've learned that the Germans like to do everything 100%. I think those of us who have attended the conference and at 10:30 on a Saturday night are about to listen to a fascinating panel with 4 brilliant economists will attest to the fact that this is really 100%. The second thing I've learned is that Rob actually really hates me because I'm moderating this panel at 10:30 on a Saturday night. So I want to propose to you guys a social compact between speakers and spoken to. The deal is, I have arranged with our esteemed panel, they're going to try to keep it short. They were promised 25 minutes before they got here. I said to them, try to keep it between 10 and 12, okay? So I want you to reward them. The person who speaks the most succinctly, I think we should give a collective prize to. And most importantly, please, if you're here, reward them with your attention. I can see that some people are starting to fall asleep. Other people want to start to talk to the people at their table. If you don't want to listen, please leave now, really. But if you're going to be here, please stay and pay attention. And if they do talk for too long, I'll yell at them as well, with your support. Okay, so it is... Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so we have a truly fantastic panel, not, as Thomas already said, not developing countries, but a non-US, non-European perspective. We're going to hear first from my very old friend, one of the most brilliant economists around, and one of my most relied upon sources, particularly on Russia, Sergei Guriev, the rector of the New Economic School, and also I have to say, in addition to being a brilliant economist, for me, one of the real moral voices in Russia today.
Thank you.
Then next, Next, we're going to hear from Richard Koo. Richard's presentation has been flagged by many, many people. It is long awaited. I hope everyone has done what I've done, which is printed it out and read it beforehand. He's going to have a few slides. This is actually very important, talking about balance sheet recessions. Next, we're going to hear from Andrew Sheng. Andrew said he's such a famous guy, he needs no introduction. INET aficionados will remember that he referred very popularly to Godzilla banks last year. That was pretty good. And he is the head of the Fang Institute, working closely with INET. And last but not least, the future president of Chile. I'm a journalist, I'm allowed to make predictions like that. Andres Velasco, former Minister of Finance, also, of course, a very fine economist. And we're concluding with a politician because he's trying to learn how not to be an economist and how to be a real rabble-rouser. So he's going to really wrap things up in a way that wakes us up and gives us the energy to finish. Okay, gentlemen, Sergei, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure the prize for brevity is another 25 minutes, right? Okay, thank you. So it's a big honor to speak here. I think talking about non-orthodoxies, it's actually nice to come from the country where Orthodoxy is a dominant religion. But more seriously, I think it is actually important to look at what Russia and other transition countries have been through, and Europe and US now have to learn a lot. And the reason is now Europe is going through the crisis. We start to understand, same in the US, we start to understand how things that we've taken for granted in the developed countries are actually should not be taken for granted. Things like governance institutions, things like moral fiber, social structure, trust, all of these things are actually not to be taken for granted, and this is exactly the lesson from transition countries, and especially Russia. And I think, unlike many people on the panel, I'm coming from the country where the assumption that government is benevolent is never made. So we learn a lot about how governance institutions develop, how they actually become more or less benevolent, and how that is interacting with the social capital and trust. And in that sense, talking about these issues in a narrow economic orthodoxy way is completely misleading. So whenever we talk about these issues, we need to understand sociology, political science, psychology, law. We really need to talk about issues which narrow economic narrative is not sufficient for. And yet, I think it would be a mistake if we talk about, I think in this panel, we will talk about lessons for developed countries. I think it's too early to be complacent, saying that, look, Russia has no budget deficit, no sovereign debt, growing, inflation is coming down. How do we talk to countries which are in sovereign debt crisis? Remember how developed countries talk to the developing countries back in 80s or 90s. I think there is no reason for complacency, especially for Russia. Even though Russian macroeconomic situation is good, it's only good because oil price is high. If oil price goes down, then Russia will face the very same fiscal challenges. And even if oil price doesn't go down because of the pension system challenges, Russia will definitely face fiscal problems 10 years down the road. And in that sense, I think it is important to learn how we tackle this challenge. And I think the most important lesson from recent years of the crisis is you can only cut inefficient government spending if the governance institutions and the social capital work well. In what sense? If you come out and say, how about we cut inefficient government expenditures, sometimes public doesn't support you. Why? Because they say you pay less to teachers and to doctors, so you can have more money for investment bankers and politicians. And unless you can convince the public that politicians are in the same boat with the public, cutting government expenditures is very hard. And this is what we observe in some European countries, but not in others. We saw that in Baltic states, nobody remembers about austerity in Baltic states anymore, right? Because cutting was painful, but it happens. happened, and these countries are doing reasonably well. Why? Because there was trust, and governance institutions generally worked. In Greece, it's going to be much more painful. In Italy, it will be also painful. And in that sense, I think the more integrity there is in the system, the easier it is actually to reform and to respond to fiscal challenges. Now, one other thing is that people start to take for granted the democratic institutions per se, but we also see that it's not always easy to build a system. So Russia actually has a constitution. Russia has checks and balances. These things are all on paper. To what extent these things can work well? I think the lesson you take from Russia, and actually you can learn this lesson and apply it into some European countries and some American states as well, you see that sometimes things that seem to work don't necessarily work. And the reason is because political system is imperfect, because voters are not always rational, voters don't always have perfect information about politicians, and the political mechanisms that enforce political promises and campaign promises don't always work. And politicians to promote their message, to raise funds to promote their message, unfortunately sometimes become hostage to interest groups. How does that change? I think Russia now offers a very important lesson. Now we see a technological change in Russia, and we see that modern technology can actually change the discourse and the system of communication between politicians and voters. And even though we have a complete censorship on TV, we see that internet allows the new politicians to communicate with the voters, to send their message, and also to make a reasonably cheap mechanism for getting ideas back from the public and fundraising from the public, even fundraising for through retail campaigns. And I think this is a very important lesson. We saw some of that already happening in the US in the recent campaigns, and I think more and more of that will be happening soon. I think once the technology is becoming cheaper, direct democracy is also becoming cheaper. Soon, I think referendum will not be an exception. It will be more like a rule. If a politician wants an answer from the public, he will not ask a sociologist to run a poll. He will just put this question online and will be able to get direct response from the public. Is that simple? I don't think so. The technology is not necessarily helping to create a level playing field. Why? Because once you have Twitter, blogs, social networks, what you can get fragmented information sets. You can have what's called confirmation bias, and this is what we know from psychology very well. Readers of Wall Street Journal will read Wall Street Journal, readers of Washington Post will read Washington Post. And their information sets will not overlap. They will never understand that they actually live in the same country, because their countries they live in are very different. Same now is in Russia. There is a party of people which watch TV, which is censored. The other party is getting their news from the internet. These people just don't understand they live in the same country. And in that sense, it's not necessarily true that new technology is making things simple. Now, but there are things which are solvable. And in particular, this is an issue where, I guess, developed and developing countries face similar challenges, for example, corporate governance. We know that corporate democracy does not necessarily work well, neither in emerging markets nor in the United States. How many of us believe that boards are really accountable to shareholders? It's not necessarily true that it is always the case, and recent scandals show that some of the boards don't function, and some of the boards are captured by the management. And here I'm very optimistic. I think that this new technology will actually create a system where it will be easier for independent board members to run campaigns on the web and actually collect votes and get nominated and become more transparent and more accountable. But some things are not that easy, and some things are very difficult. And when we think about financial stability, for example, this is where technological progress actually makes things more complicated. We talked today a lot about how we prevent next crisis. I think we should be open and honest, and we should say that bubbles will be blown and burst again and again. Why? Because the new technology is always very hard to evaluate. We always will value Twitters and Facebooks and Instagrams of this world probably a bit higher than they should be valued. Why? Because, again, psychologists tell us people like to think that the world is better than it actually is. People like to be more optimistic. Everybody here in this room is driving the car above average. everybody's kid is more beautiful than everybody else's kid. And the same works in the stock market, and people will blow the bubbles unless the bubbles burst. And I think it will be going on and on again. It's easier to value a brick and mortar company. It's very hard to value a company which is producing something very new. And in that sense, I'm not optimistic that we'll be able to prevent financial crisis. Now, another thing is, of course, global governance. And this is where emerging markets are looking up to developed countries and are hoping that some solution will be worked out. And here, I think the battleground is Europe. I think when we talk about how Europe is in crisis, we shouldn't forget how important and how successful Europe has been as a model of global governance. I think it is absolutely necessary that Europe succeeds, reforms itself, and is successful again, because if Europe doesn't succeed, it will be very hard to build global governance institutions. And I think it's going to be very difficult in any event, but I think we should remember that we do have a functioning multinational, a supranational organization, which in general is actually working out reasonably well. But for that to work out, to continue to work well, I think developed countries should stick to the principles they announce. I think this is a very important point because, as I said, not all emerging market governments are benevolent. They always are happy to point at the US or Europe and say, look, there is a lot of hypocrisy going on out there. They preach competition, but then they actually distort global trade rules, including in agriculture, including in some other industries, and that actually hits poor countries. And I think until the developed countries actually stick to the standards they promote, the developing countries will always refer to the hypocrisy, and the non-benevolent governments in those countries will always be happy not to stick to those principles themselves. And of course, that refers to macroeconomic policy as well. As I said, Russia is now not behaving as responsibly in terms of pension system and macroeconomics as it should. And the reason, of course, is the Russian government says, look at Europe. We are doing better than Europe. Look at the US. We are doing better than the US. And that, of course, unfortunately, now a very low standard. But that, I think, is for an issue of a reserve currency. I think it is extremely important that, that these countries start to stick to what they promise. In particular, the Eurozone members should stick to Maastricht criteria finally. Another very important issue we discussed during this conference, and this is now a truly global issue, which is inequality of opportunity. It is now true that within the countries and between the countries, there is a clear understanding, at least the perception is there, but probably this perception is based on facts, that opportunity is not equal. Now, some people would say that modern technology actually contributed to understanding this fact. Now we definitely know what it is like to be a poor kid in Africa. Previously, we wouldn't know because we didn't have that information technology. Now we do. And we know we have a lot of data, and we saw this data during the conference, how within the US the inequality is actually unequal. And that is how we are all very unhappy about this challenge. Now, what is the solution to this challenge? And I want to sound optimistic in the end. I would say that technological progress also creates cheap access to knowledge. And the further away we go, the cheaper the technology is and the more accessible the knowledge is wherever you're born. And we know that education is the ultimate solution to inequality of opportunity. And again, we talked a lot about this during this conference. And here, let me finish on an optimistic note for INET to challenge the orthodoxy. INET can actually circumvent the orthodoxy and reach out to people everywhere through the new technology. And I know that INET is now working on the online university, and I think it's a very right solution because the public is out there and it is reachable through the new technology, which is becoming cheaper and more accessible even in the developing countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergei. Fascinating as expected.